Good afternoon, everyone. We are still going to wait for a little bit before we officially start at 3 p.m., but thank you for attending. We'll get started at 3 p.m. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. We are still going to hold on for a couple minutes. We have people trickling in, so I want to make sure that we get a lot of people here at the beginning for when we go over the House rules and introduce our speaker. Thank you so much for holding.
Hello.
Thank you for holding, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michael Weiss. I am filling in for Dave Woodward, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, but I am happy to be here with you as we talk today in our last September webinar, Policies and Programs to Address Police Violence. First, a few housekeeping rules. Public Leadership Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and leadership center organized to raise public awareness on key issues of equity and justice and to develop public leaders who will improve the economic and social conditions of all Americans. We do invite you to go to our website, publicleadershipinstitute.org, where you can find out many model bills on all sorts of issues, including civil rights and justice. Now, important. This is a participation webinar. We want you to ask questions, talk to our speaker, our wonderful speaker today, our guest speaker. But how do you do that? It's very simple. On your panel on the right, you will see a hand icon with an up button. Press that. That means you have a question. You can either read your question, speak your question. I can call on you if you're plugged into the audio, or you can type in your question and I will read it to our presenter. If you have any questions to me personally, please feel free to also type them in there as well. With that said, I would like to pass this over to our resident webinar expert, Bernie Horn, who will talk about our guest speaker today. Bernie, can you hear me? Bernie? Oh, there you go. Bernie, can you try now?
Yeah?
Oh, great.
Okay. I just wanted to give you a bio for our speaker, Samuel Singyang Wei. Samuel is a policy analyst and data scientist who works with communities of color to fight systemic racism through cutting-edge policies and strategies. Sam has supported movement activists across the country to collect and use data as a tool to fight police violence through mapping police violence and to push for comprehensive policy solutions to end police violence through Campaign Zero. Previously, Sam worked at PolicyLink to support a national network of 61 Promise neighborhoods communities to build cradle-to-career systems of support for low-income families. He also worked with city leaders, youth activists, and community organizations to develop comprehensive agendas to achieve quality education, health, and justice for young black men. Sam grew up in Orlando and has been involved in organizing and advocacy since he was in high school. He graduated from Stanford, where he studied how race and racism impact the U.S. political system. So shall we turn it over to Sam?
Yes, thank you so much. I will now push this over to Samuel.
All right. So my name is Sam Sinyangwe. Thank you for the introduction. Let me just enable my screen really quick. All right. So today I'm going to go over the work that we have done at Campaign Zero, which, as was mentioned, is a national organization focused on supporting activists, elected officials, and concerned citizens to identify and implement comprehensive policy solutions to end police violence in the United States. And we do this by an approach that actually, as I'm going to describe, is data-informed and collaborative, sharing and borrowing from the insights of tens of thousands of activists across the country, as well as leading research institutions and other groups. So our work started in the aftermath of Ferguson, as the country and the national conversation, spurred on by the protests enveloping the nation, really devolved into this question of whether or not these incidents of police violence were in fact a series of isolated incidents or part of a broader pattern or practice of police violence. And the reason that that question continued to reverberate and continued to be asked in the media was because the federal government didn't collect comprehensive data on police-involved killings nationwide. So we simply didn't have the data to answer that question, let alone to understand what the effective solutions to reducing that number, whatever it is, would be. So at that point, I was a policy researcher working in an Oakland nonprofit with a background in data science, and I realized that so much of this data, in fact, was available online, but nobody had compiled it, had put it in one place, had made sense of it, and had used it to actually identify best practices. And so I connected with leading movement activists on the ground in Ferguson, and together we built Campaign Zero, and that started with our first project, which was a data project called Mapping Police Violence. And so what we found was, and you can see in this map here, we found that over 1,200 people are killed by police every year in the United States, and a rate far higher than per capita than other countries. And moreover, we found that the rate is pretty consistent over time, with again 1,123 people killed in 2013, 1,167 people killed in 2014, 1,207 people killed in 2015, and already over 800 people killed by police so far this year in 2016. We found that, as many of you know, police violence is distributed disproportionately, with black residents 3 times more likely to be killed by police than their white peers. We also did breakdowns by state. So we wanted to understand in which places was police violence occurring disproportionately, and in which places was it actually not occurring as much. So then we could get into a question about why. What are the underlying causes, and then what are the underlying solutions to ultimately end police violence in the United States. So we mapped the data across by state, and this is what we found. So we found that there is wide variation in the rate per capita of police-involved killings by state, and that in almost every state, black residents were more likely to be killed than their white counterparts. So you can see the graph here. It shows the rate of police-involved killings for all people in the sort of bluish purple, as well as for black people in the red. We also use the data to address some important issues and questions that have emerged from people who really want to understand what's going on and how to address this issue. And one of those key questions was the extent to which police-involved killings were a function of crime rates in a given area. You hear this common narrative around black-on-black crime or community violence, that police are policing in often dangerous areas, and therefore they encounter situations where deadly force is more likely to be used. What we actually found was that the data shows that there's no correlation between violent crime rates in U.S. cities and the rates of police-involved killings. So something else is contributing to police-involved killings that is different than crime. And so to answer that question, and again, before I get in there, I want to just show this one last slide, which shows 2 cities that are virtually identical in terms of population and demographics and crime rates, but have vastly different levels of police violence, particularly police-involved killings. So what is happening that is going well in Newark, and what is happening that is going wrong in St. Louis? And that question led us into a policy discussion. So we interrogated the data really to understand what were the initial causes or reasons initiating those police encounters. We worked with activists across the country to source policy ideas, as well as the President's task force, on which one of our co-founders sits, to really develop a comprehensive platform of policy solutions to address this issue. And this is what it's called. It's called Campaign Zero. And so it's a 10-point policy plan that includes things like ending broken windows policing, so that criminalization and over-policing of low-level offenses like turnstile jumping or possession of small amounts of marijuana. It includes strengthening community oversight structures, developing policies that impose restrictions on how and when police use force, improving the investigations and prosecutions of police killings by making them more independent. So you hear like a special prosecutor, it falls within that category. Improving community representation, so police forces that represent the community in terms of race and gender, as well as residency. And then body cameras, filming, strengthening citizens' capacity to film the police, training on a variety of areas, including de-escalation and crisis intervention, ending for-profit policing, which includes things like civil asset forfeiture, and what we saw in Ferguson with the excessive fines and fees on low-income residents. And then finally, demilitarizing the police and addressing the barriers to accountability that are often embedded in police union contracts and statewide police bills of rights. So, from a high level, that's sort of the overview of the platform, and I'm going to delve into some more specific recommendations, the data behind them, as well as the actual language and details around what it takes to implement these types of solutions. So, we broke down these solutions. The first thing we did was break these down by federal, state, and local level. So you can go to joincampaign0.org, and depending on what level of government you are either advocating for change within or are a part of, you can find an agenda that's relevant to you. And we also develop tools to empower advocates and activists, as well as do advocacy ourselves, to push for these policies at every level of government. So we've shaped the President's 21st Century Task Force report, as well as Hillary Clinton's policing agenda and the DNC agenda. And finally, we develop technologies and tools that connect people directly with their representatives so that they can push for these policies to be enacted. So this is a tool that you put in your zip code, shows you who your state representatives are, what their positions are on these issues, and allows you to contact them all in 3 clicks or less. So from a broad overview, that's what we do. And now I'm going to dive into some of the specifics. So the first thing is, to recognize that, as I said, the data has only recently even been available on a national level regarding police-involved killings. And that's really the tip of the iceberg, because we know that that is a very small proportion of the total sort of universe of police violence when you think about all uses of force, tasers, when you think about sexual assault, stops, searches, frisks, all of these types of interactions that oftentimes can deteriorate police community trust and in some cases lead to injury or death. But because we were able to actually collect comprehensive data on police-involved killings, it permitted a robust analysis of how you actually can address that issue as a starting point. So the project that we actually just launched today is focused on police use of force policies. And so we looked at the 100 largest police departments in America, and we received their use of force policies of the police department. We reviewed those policies for 8 particular provisions that establish restrictions, clear restrictions on how and when police use force against civilians. And then we did a statistical analysis matching those up to the rates of police-involved killings of those departments. And what you find is that, in fact, the departments that implement these types of solutions, so things like requiring officers to exhaust all other reasonable means of apprehension before resorting to shooting somebody, banning chokeholds and strangleholds, using a use of force continuum that specifies the specific types of force that can be used for specific types of resistance, requiring officers to de-escalate situations, restricting shooting at moving vehicles so that the vehicle itself is not justification for an officer to fire if it's coming at you, for example. Those policies actually are associated with lower rates of police-involved killings individually. So each of those 8 policies actually has a base of evidence that it correlates with lower rates of police-involved killings. But the real results that we found were when we actually looked at the impact of these policies when implemented together. So when you take a more comprehensive approach that sort of is broader than any one single solution and looks more at the sum total, the total number of these solutions that are implemented by police departments, you see more dramatic effects. So what you see here is that police departments that adopt 4 or more of these policies, and again, that is a minority of police departments right now, actually have substantially lower rates of police-involved killings. It's such that a police department that adopts all 8 of these policies has 72% fewer police-involved killings than a department that adopts none, right? So 72% from these 8 policies alone. What we also found was that, contrary to what we hear, these restrictive use of force policies do not endanger officers. So you hear, oftentimes police unions and some law enforcement groups make the claim that, you're sort of tying the hands of officers to defend themselves, and therefore, any sort of restrictions on use of force can actually lead to more danger for officers. We actually found the opposite to be true when you look at the data. Officers in departments with a higher number of these restrictive policies were actually less likely to be assaulted in the line of duty, less likely to be killed in the line of duty, and no more likely to be injured during an assault. So now I'm going to sort of translate some of this, because that was at the local level. I want to translate it to the state level, because we know that this solution requires action at every level of government, and in particular requires action at the local and state levels, because the federal government doesn't really play a very powerful or influential role over law enforcement as the police departments themselves or the state. As you know, there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies, many of which have different standards and policies, and in many cases, due to inaction in Congress, the state has the power really to make the greatest impact on improving the situation regarding police violence in a particular jurisdiction. So I'm going to go over a couple of sort of model policies that match the data that I just showed you. So for example, we saw at the local level how a police department's administrative policy requiring officers to exhaust all other means before using deadly force was associated with a 25% reduction in police-involved killings. What you see here is that, in fact, there are a couple of states, only a few, that actually have legislation, deadly force laws, that reflect this standard. So Tennessee is one of those states, and there are a couple of more states. Delaware is another one, as well as Rhode Island and Iowa. Only those 4 states currently have a deadly force law that establishes that restriction on officers that actually makes deadly force a last resort. And when you look at the data, again, going back to that chart on police-involved killings rates by state, those 4 states have lower rates of police-involved killings than average. The second key policy is around independent investigations and prosecutions. So at the state level, the state can play a powerful role in ensuring that investigations and prosecutions of police-involved killings and other serious uses of force are done independently and transparently, and that actually avoid that conflict of interest that we've seen time and time again between local prosecutors and the police departments that they work hand in hand with to enforce the law. So, for example, Connecticut just recently enacted legislation that requires an independent prosecutor and investigation of police-involved killings. The next key sort of tenet in terms of best practices at the state level is to really improve reporting and accountability. And so again, Connecticut is leading the way right now. They have actually established a clear policy preventing officers who have resigned or been fired under investigation for excessive force from being rehired at another department. So, if you recall, many officers, including the officer who killed Tamir Rice in Ohio, was actually an officer that had a previous record of misconduct from another law enforcement agency, but just was able to transfer and sort of erase that record as he went and retain his job. What this does is actually require notification of that previous record and actually bar officers that are at the extreme end of that from ever serving again in the state. And I think that's an important standard to set to give the community confidence, as well as to prevent some of these officers from still serving on the force. Because as we know, when you look at the data, including in big projects like the Chicago Police Data Project, where they collected the civilian complaint records of the entire police department, they found that a small proportion of officers was actually responsible for a disproportionate number of use of force complaints against them. So this actually helps address that issue. Along those lines, Maryland actually recently enacted legislation, here is the language of that now, that establishes a system whereby law enforcement agencies have to report to a commission every year the number of serious officer-involved incidents each year, the number of officers disciplined for those incidents, and the type of discipline that was received. So here you have transparency and reporting, really ensuring that the public is aware of how many incidents are occurring, and also what type of action has been taken to ensure accountability. Second important part is around community representation. So, and this is actually an area where there hasn't been a lot of action at the state level, despite numerous calls from communities to ensure and take action to ensure that police departments represent the communities that they are serving. Connecticut is in fact the only state that we have found in our review of legislation in all 50 states that has explicitly adopted a requirement that jurisdictions that serve a high concentration of minority residents develop a clear plan to recruit, retain, and promote minority police officers to ensure that the department is representative of the community. And that includes, as you can see, they outline a range of strategies to do that. It also includes a policy such that a new position shall be filled by hiring or promoting a minority candidate when the qualifications of such candidate exceed or are equal to that of any other candidate or candidates being considered for a job of police officer. So this, again, is an affirmative policy to actually take action and ensure that police departments reflect communities. Another key issue is around militarization of the police. So we saw in Ferguson militarized police departments, and actually we saw last night in Charlotte as the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department actually tear-gassed protesters, something that can cause long-term illness and injury, and really should not be allowed on our streets. And so we've seen states like Montana actually take action to limit and restrict the militarization of police agencies by preventing agencies within the state from receiving the most extreme sort of classes of military weapons, things like drones, aircraft, grenades, silencers, military vehicles, and others. And beyond just restricting the provision of those military equipments from the federal government for free under the 1033 program, they also prevent agencies from using federal funds to purchase that property outside of those programs. So those are just a few issues within the broader sort of structure or comprehensive approach that I articulated with the Campaign Zero graphic. Other issues, as I'm sure you know, involve body cameras and the ability of citizens to film the police, something that has really been a key issue in terms of swift adoption by police departments. And we've seen departments, or rather we've seen states enact legislation addressing body cameras that in large part actually doesn't ensure accountability, but rather undermines it by doing things like allowing police officers to review footage before making initial statements, something that allows them to sort of craft their statement in response to what they know was captured by the camera. And we've also seen states like North Carolina actually move to prevent public access to any body camera footage. So those are things that are happening right now that really are not in the spirit of accountability, but on the other hand, we do see some states taking action to actually open up public access. We've seen the District of Columbia, for example, adopt a pretty far-reaching body camera policy that not only ensures public access by making it a public record, the body camera footage, but also gives the mayor explicit power to expedite that footage if, for whatever reason, it is taking too long to be sent, or rather received via FOIA request. We've seen some action on the decriminalization and ending broken windows front. We've seen marijuana decriminalization efforts happening at the state level, and again, about 15% of police-involved killings actually originate from one of the sort of low-level broken windows offenses, including drug possession. And so that's why this is so important, not only for preventing police violence, but also for addressing mass incarceration. Community oversight tends to happen at the local level, but we have seen some bills being proposed that are good examples. And for example, in North Carolina, that would actually empower civilian review boards to have greater powers, for example, subpoena power or discipline power over officers, and that direct funds to those agencies, which are often underfunded, under-resourced, and don't have enough investigators to perform their function. Training, I think, is a no-brainer. It is something that a number of states have taken action on and is a part of the solution when you think about de-escalation training, crisis intervention training, and other types of training. A statistic was released from the Police Executive Research Forum, which showed that the average police recruit receives 58 hours of firearms training. And by the way, that includes training where the officer is firing at center mass of the subject, and that is basically a kill shot. What we have seen is departments actually now moving to invest more heavily in de-escalation, in communication, in crisis intervention, which currently only receive about 8 hours of training compared to that 58. And so, a best practice in this regard would be to actually establish just as many hours, if not more, of de-escalation and communication as are actually being spent on using firearms. And then finally, the area of ending for-profit policing. We've seen some movement from a variety of states, particularly in the Midwest and the Southwest, to end civil asset forfeiture, which is a practice whereby police can seize property or cash from civilians even if they haven't been convicted of a crime. So we've seen actually states now moving to prohibit that practice and require a criminal conviction and a clear and convincing connection between that property and the criminal conviction in order for police to seize those assets. So at a high level, those are the types of policies that can work, that can address this issue. While the base of data continues to evolve, there is evidence and a growing body of evidence behind many of these policies. And so I will pause there, and I'm eager to hear any questions that you might have, as well as if you want to dive deeper into any one of these areas, I'm happy to do that as well. And I'll end with this slide with a number of resources that you can go to learn more. So thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Yes, once again, please, this is an interactive webinar. If you do have questions, we do have a few right now, but feel free to type them in or raise your hand, and I will click on you, and you can ask it yourself. First question I have is from Bill. He says, I attended a local citizens police academy. I get the impression that police training and practices in any data is generally inconsistent and incomplete. Is that what you see, and are there solutions to this?
So if I hear that question right, it is focused on the difficulty of collecting data on existing training practices as well as issues in terms of ensuring quality, which is a related issue. Is that correct?
I believe that is what Bill is talking about, yes.
So what we have proposed and what we have seen as an effective practice is, number one, having community deeply involved in those trainings. So, for example, Safe Harbor is an organization in the Baltimore area where they have Baltimore youth, particularly young black men, who are most deeply impacted by policing are actually playing a role in leading trainings so that it actually does more than just inform officers, but actually builds relationships, builds trust, and in many cases flips the power dynamic such that you have folks who have been disempowered by the system playing a role in actually structuring the training and actually teaching officers how they would like to be interacted with. And I think that is where we see some more effective trainings moving. And again, that is one piece of it. Crisis intervention is a whole nother category that needs to be addressed. So we see departments like in San Antonio and others beginning to create crisis intervention teams and mental health evaluation teams where they actually partner with mental health professionals and specially trained officers in crisis intervention, at least 40 hours training, to actually respond to all mental health calls. So I guess the short answer to that question is yes, it is incredibly difficult to collect good, reliable, and up-to-date data on training practices that are happening. It's even more difficult to evaluate their effectiveness. And part of what can help solve that is increasing transparency and reporting of data. But another key piece is really to ensure that trainings have teeth, right? So a lot of times with trainings, what you see is that it is a session. Officers will go show up at the session almost like a class, and then they'll leave. But how they perform in that training really doesn't have a bearing on their performance evaluations, doesn't have a bearing on whether or not they're deployed to particular communities, doesn't have a bearing on the actual things that matter as an employee. And so what can work is actually having trainings whereby, for example, if you're in implicit bias training and you demonstrate a high level of bias, that actually makes it less likely for you to be deployed to a community of color, for example. And there you can actually start to see trainings be more effective. And while the evidence base is relatively thin right now on what are the most effective trainings, we do see that anti-bias trainings that are more intensive, more regular, and that involve community have been shown to be a little bit more effective.
Excellent. I have Anna here with a question. Anna, can you hear me? Hello, Anna?
Yes.
Yes, you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to know if it's possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint with all the wonderful charts and ideas. We've hired a consultant in our township to study our police procedures and talk to police and people in the community to try to prevent injuries and death. And I think some of this would be super helpful in helping us look at the procedures and training we have and how to improve it.
Definitely. So I will send this out to the organizers of the webinar, and I'm sure they'll share it with the attendees of the group.
Yes, I will be happy to make sure that all the attendees will receive a copy. We will also be posting this webinar on our YouTube page, and you can find that, which I will also send a link to as well.
Great.
Next question I have is from Pamela. She says, thank you for the excellent database presentation and explanations. You will likely cover this in the remainder of the discussion, but if not, I would really appreciate any information on whether police compensation, for example, paying our police more with corresponding higher qualification requirements, has been analyzed or considered.
So that's a great question, something that we have heard, but unfortunately I have not seen any data on that. And I think now that we have data on police-involved killings, I believe we might be able to get data on police compensation and cross-reference them and get back to you on that. I do know that I lived in San Francisco for 7 years, and police in San Francisco make something like $80,000–$90,000 starting, and San Francisco is an area that is one of the hot spots for police violence. So that alone is just it could be an anecdotal story, but I haven't seen evidence to support that claim, and I have seen examples of high-paid police officers that are not necessarily less violent in policing.
Great. I have Claire here who asks, how do we educate the public about the need to move away from fee-based criminal justice systems that depend on court costs and fines rather than general tax revenues for their funding? Similarly, how do we make clear that professional policing requires communities to be willing to pay officers professional salaries? In our locality, the standing salary is less than what is needed to pay for a 2-bedroom apartment at 30% of income.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of a corollary to the previous question. I think public sector employees in general are underpaid, whether you're a teacher or what have you. I also think that more research needs to be done in this area to really figure out one way or the other what role salary plays in this, as well as if salary is a key contributing factor. I think we need to be making the case for that as well, using that data. In terms of funding, what we often see is that when you look at city budgets, particularly for larger cities, something like 30, 40, 50% of the budget often goes to the police department, or at least the general fund goes to the police department. And that is oftentimes not necessarily the best investment, right? So we know that investing in, for example, early childhood education, investing in community programs, after-school programs actually has a higher return on investment than investing in law enforcement and incarceration. And so, part of the salary question might be an issue of actually having too many police officers on staff, such that you actually don't have enough money to pay them all good salary. And of course, this depends by city. You can't make a blanket statement that that every city has too many police officers, because that's not the case. But again, I would encourage you to look at the total amount of funding that is going to the police department, how that compares to other city functions, and whether or not, rather than sort of continuing to invest in policing, whether it might make sense to actually invest in some alternative approaches. For example, the city of Orlando invested in a program called the Paramore Kid Zone, where they identified the highest crime, highest poverty neighborhood in the city. Something like 2,000 or 3,000 people lived in that neighborhood, and they decided to concentrate resources in that specific neighborhood, such that they connected every young person in that neighborhood, a 98% black neighborhood, to an after-school program, to a mentor, to somebody who is going to support them through their academic trajectory, instead of investing all that money in the police. And what they found was that in only a few years, the violent crime rate in that neighborhood dropped 85%. And so there are examples of successful strategies to address crime that are actually cost-effective, and that actually direct money to community members. So it can sort of be like a win-win, where you're employing folks who are at risk using that funding, and you're able to pay them a higher salary, and you're able to actually address crime at the same time.
Fantastic. Speaking of data, going back to the for-profit policing, what about for-profit prisons? Have you found any strong correlations in the areas that have for-profit prisons and how they affect police brutality and incarceration?
So we have not done that analysis yet. It's definitely something that needs to be done. There has been some research, recent research that has come out on for-profit prisons, and great investigative journalism that has shown that conditions in for-profit prisons are worse than those in public prisons, as well as, oftentimes what you see is that there is an incentive there to keep a certain number of beds filled, such that it can actually lead to a tendency to incarcerate more and more people. I have not seen data that connects that explicitly to police brutality or police violence, but this is definitely something that I wouldn't be surprised is happening, and that I think deserves more attention.
Okay. I have another question from Bill. It's a little more state specific, but he says, I noticed in an earlier slide that Oklahoma was the second most dangerous state. What are the root causes for that?
So we can go back to Oklahoma. Let's see. And Oklahoma, it is fascinating. Oklahoma, yes, third, and that's counting D.C., so it's actually the second among the 50 states. Oklahoma is very fascinating. When you look at the data on Oklahoma, so much of it is actually concentrated in Oklahoma City. So Oklahoma City Police Department, year over year, is consistently one of the highest, has consistently one of the highest rates of police-involved killings of any city in the country. And a lot of that a lot of the people who are killed are mentally ill, are folks who are killed at a traffic stop, for example. So something is going on, particularly in Oklahoma City, that is contributing to this. Certainly that doesn't account for everything going on in the state, and clearly, as we've seen in Tulsa, there are broader problems there. But a short answer would be I'm not sure, and I think that deserves a lot more attention. What I can do, if you're in Oklahoma and you're interested, is actually pull the spreadsheet of data specific to Oklahoma and do a more in-depth analysis, really looking at some of the causes behind it, what types of encounters are happening, how did those initiate, which police departments are responsible, what are their policies, to really be able to give you a more informed answer for that. So if you're interested in that, definitely send me an email, sam@thisisthemovement.org, and I'd be happy to do that.
Fantastic. I'm going to send that email address to everyone in the chat. Can you repeat that for me again?
Yes, it's Sam, S-A-M, @thisisthemovement.org.
Fantastic. Everyone should now have it. We have another question. This comes from Carolyn. Carolyn, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. I was just wondering, when you hear about these police shootings, they often say the person is armed. And I was just wondering about the interplay with, the ready accessibility of guns and police violence. It kind of gives them a convenient excuse. And I don't know, I'd just like a comment about that. Can you hear me?
Yes. And I think this goes without saying that guns are a whole another conversation, a huge issue that definitely interplays with this, and is just as intractable. I think when you look at some of the states that have very high rates of police-involved killings, many of them are in the Midwest, Southwest. Areas where there is substantial gun ownership, and I do think that is a contributing factor. There has been some research done, and I'm trying to think if it was Think Progress, it might have been another organization that showed that there was a correlation between the two, and certainly that needs to be addressed as well. What we also know, though, is that when you look at a national level, about 60% of police-involved killings involved somebody who either didn't have a gun or was armed but should not have actually interacted with that police officer in the first place. So these are folks who might have been turnstile jumping or selling loose cigarettes on the sidewalk, or doing things that actually it could have been a non-police response. It could have been a mental health provider that responded, a conflict de-escalator. because the offense was so low level and was not a violent offense. So, while guns are a huge factor, it certainly is true that we can dramatically reduce police violence, even including the level of gun ownership that we have in this country. And many of the policies that are shared can bring us to that place. I think ultimately in a country with so much gun ownership, that is always going to be a factor, and something that police officers are aware of and will have to sort of be trained to de-escalate effectively in order to actually get to a place of safety for both community and officers.
Thank you, Samuel. We do have a couple more minutes left. If anyone else would like to ask a question, please feel free to press the raise hand icon or type it into the question section. What happens when de-escalation is attempted but then doesn't work? For example, in West Virginia recently, an officer was fired for trying de-escalation when he didn't fire at the suspect.
So again, that is that's a situation where de-escalation is one policy within a broader matrix of policies that needs to be adopted. So de-escalation is a very important first response, and then you need a use of force continuum that ensures that the next response beyond the de-escalation tactic is not deadly force, but is rather less lethal force, or calling in backup, or having another response than deadly force, making that a last resort. And then finally, it means having a police department and a police chief, as well as a broader sort of system of reporting and transparency, accountability and civilian oversight to actually ensure that that type of decision or culture in a police department where not shooting somebody is seen as a problem is actually dealt with and removed from the police department before it results in further police violence.
I have a question regarding social media. Do you see social media as a tool to help enhance accountability, or is it become a hindrance in data and investigations?
I see social media as a tool to enhance accountability. I think, obviously any tool can be used for good or for evil. Certainly, there are examples of social media being used in negative ways. But I think, by and large, what we've seen is social media really make this conversation possible by amplifying and giving voice to those who traditionally have been voiceless in this conversation, and allowing the rapid sharing of information and videos that can really shed light on what's going on in communities. I think, beyond that, social media is also an incredible organizing tool. So, a lot of the data collection that you see here, the analysis, the visualization, is done in part by people who connect to us through social media, want to get involved, are highly skilled, but don't know how they can help out. And social media is a network that connects us together and allows for the work of creating change and making the case for change to be done. And so I think that is all positive. I think ultimately, it is, like with any medium, it is a leadership challenge to figure out new and better ways to push social media platforms to actually be used, productively, and to be used for solutions, such that people don't get, dispirited or grow frustrated or angry in a way that is not productive, but rather so that it can continue to organize people, connect them to one another, leverage their relative strengths, and build something that is greater than some of its parts.
I agree with you. I think, sadly, without social media, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And in this day and age, it really has brought the spotlight to the issue. I have one more question. It is from Craig, and he asks, Any stories of police departments partnering with Campaign Zero or notably endorsing its goals? How can we recognize and exemplify the local department that are already making great strides?
Yeah, so there are some examples. We worked, for example, with the city of Orlando to really, what we did was we looked at the data on policing in Orlando. We did a breakdown of the causes, the contributing factors. We looked at their police union contract. We looked at their use of force policy, their civilian review board, how it was structured, and we came up with a very detailed analysis of the areas where the department is strong and the areas where it falls short, and what recommendations they could adopt. And they ended up adopting many of those recommendations, and in terms of changing their use of force policy, releasing new and better data. And so that's a great example of what can be done. I think ultimately what is clear is that when you look at, let's say, the 100 largest cities in America, most police departments have adopted very few of what's considered a best practice. And that's not just what we're putting out there. That is, if you look at what is commonly in Department of Justice consent decrees, what recommendations are being put out by the Police Executive Research Forum, what the President's Task Force report says. So I think there is a growing consensus in the sort of more progressive law enforcement community that there are a number of changes that need to be put in place that are not yet in place. And I think the question is, how do we continue to keep the pressure on? How do we continue to collaborate in a way that is very targeted and clear around what the goals are, what the accountability structures are, what the commitments are, and what the timelines are, in order for us to get to a place where everybody can trust one another to actually implement and hold each other accountable to doing this right.
Excellent. Well, we have time for one more question if anyone has a question. I think you did a wonderful job, Samuel, explaining a lot of details. So with that said, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Samuel, for coming on here, for having a wonderful in-depth conversation and a wonderful presentation. And we invite all of you to please go to joincampaign0.org for more information. I've given you Samuel's email. Please reach out to him with any questions. If you want model legislation, Public Leadership does have model legislation on public safety issues, including cameras on police cars and banned stun cuffs at publicleadershipinstitute.org/public_safety. Samuel, any parting words?
I would just like to say, thank you for listening to the presentation, and I'm happy to work with any of you if you want to develop, whether it is sort of a customized agenda regarding policing in your community or state. We are an open resource, and we believe that the more work we can do with more good people who want to make changes, the better. So I'm happy to work with any of you.
Thank you again so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. It's a shame that we have to have this discussion, but I'm glad we are having it. Thank you again to Samuel. Thank you all for attending. Please join us in 2 weeks for our next Voicing Our Values webinar. Thank you.